See, good that we talked about it. Now it's started to record. Um, so yeah, this webinar is recorded, and you will get the link to the recording later, so you can rewatch it if you want or share it with your colleagues if this is of interest for you. And with that, I think we will get started and jump right in. My name is Eva. Most of you probably already know me if you've ever taken part in one of our webinars in the past. I have been working with Philanthropia for a long time now. I think it comes up to more than 10 years. And I have been working in the fundraising resource mobilization field for almost 15 years. I used to work in Nepal for quite a long time. I lived in Kathmandu for 7 years and worked mostly with small grassroots NGOs. And I've also worked in South America for a while. Now I've been back to Germany since 2019 and still work with grassroots NGOs internationally to support them in their resource mobilization. Today we'll talk about the project budget, which often is a part that fundraisers don't like. When I ask in our seminars, what is your least favorite part about writing a proposal, most people say, oh, it's the budget. We don't like working on the budget. And I completely get that. It always used to be daunting for me as well, because budgets can get very complicated. The more complex your projects or programs get, the more complex the budget is. And often as fundraisers, we do like to network, we like to write text, we like to use words, but oftentimes we shy away from numbers. But the budget is nothing to be scared of. There's a couple of tips and tricks how you can go about it, and it can be a very logical way to go about these things, and then budget writing kind of loses its scare a bit. What is a project budget? Starting with a definition, the project budget describes the monetary aspects of the project and explains exactly in which areas how much money is supposed to be spent. Sometimes we also say the budget is supposed to be the description of the project in numbers. So a very skilled project manager or a grants manager, they look at your proposal, where the budget is always part, obviously. If they look at your proposal and just look at the budget, they should be able to understand at least the basic gist of your project. Of course, the justification is missing. There's a lot of context missing if you just look at the numbers, but in general, they should be able to understand what your project is planning to do by just looking at the budget. Specifically, if it's an activity-based budget, and we'll look at the difference in a moment, it should be possible to understand what your project is about by just analyzing the budget. So another question that we always get is where should we include the budget? And there's a couple of different documents, obviously in the project plan and the proposal. Sometimes you need in the concept note as well. So it's basically everywhere where you need to explain how much money you need for your project. There's two main sections of a project budget that you need to consider or keep in mind. There's the income side and the expenses side. Usually, we only think, or we mostly think about the expenses side. And this is also what we'll focus on throughout this webinar in the following slides, because the expenses or the expenditures describe how and where money will be spent. They may be itemized, summarized by category, activity, etc. There's different ways of organizing this section, but this basically describes what you want to spend money on, where the money will go, which expenses you will incur for when you implement your activities, the things that you want to do with your project. So yeah, basically where the money goes. That could be personnel costs, could be materials, could be building costs, whatever your project is about. This section describes where the money goes. And again, this is mostly what people think of when they say, oh, we have to write a budget. But the income side is also very important, specifically when you write a project proposal. Because oftentimes donors want to see if you also have income from your side. The income includes all sources of project funding, and that can be grants, donations, the value of in-kind gifts, or in-kind contributions, the value of volunteer hours, earned income, matching funds, etc. Everything that you have coming in. So these could be, as the example here says, grants, so other grants. Obviously, when you apply for a grant with someone, that should cover part of the cost. But if you have applied for other grants and you already know that you're going to get them, that is also income, because it will also cover part of the expenses that you will incur with the project. Sometimes you have other private donations from supporters, from companies, from corporations, whatever it might be. That should be included, or can be included as your own contribution or your co-payment. Sometimes you get gifts, or you have material that you want to use in your project, and then you can put the monetary value of that into your proposal as income. So for example, when I used to work in Nepal, I worked on a lot of wash projects, so we used to build bathrooms, toilets for private households. And what we had to have a co-payment by our organization and the people we worked with. And because it was difficult for them to pay money, we always asked them to provide part of the material. So for example, the bamboo that was needed to build the toilets, many people had bamboo on their fields, so they didn't have to go out and buy it, or they could exchange it with someone that has bamboo. So they didn't have to spend money, hard money, but they still contributed part. And then we were able to put that contribution as a monetary value into the budget. So let's say bamboo cost $10 per piece. I don't remember the price, that's too high, but just assuming. And then if they contributed 10 pieces of bamboo, we could put $100 into the budget as their own contribution, or as income, for to put it this way. Often you can also attribute for the value of volunteer hours. So if you have people working in your project, if you have people contributing hours to your project, you can also put the monetary value of that as income, because that's what people will spend and invest. And earned income refers mostly to income that you earn if you have, for example, a social enterprise connected to your NGO. Sometimes people have organizations have a shop where they sell stuff. Sometimes organizations have a cafe or a restaurant or something. All of this is on the income side that you can consider for your project. So just always think of both of these sides. What is the money that you have to spend to implement your project, and what is the income that you can contribute on this. When should you develop a budget? I always recommend to develop the budget as early as possible. So ideally when you plan your project, because oftentimes I see people, and I had made the same experience, and I've made the same kind of mistake, that you have a project idea and you start developing a project plan, but then you just work with guesstimates. So you think something might be that expensive. You think the project will be around $10,000. And with that, you start looking for potential donors, and you start going out. And then people just sit down to write a full budget once they want to write a proposal. I know that often is the reality, and that there's not always enough time for everything. But ideally, you would try to write the budget earlier, because oftentimes if you just guess, the numbers will not be right. I cannot count the times that I underestimated, overestimated cost for something, and then we ended up having a budget that was way too big, which is not that big of a problem, or too small. Then obviously that becomes a problem. And when you go out and look for donors, and try to find a good match for your project, you need to know how much money you're looking for. Because if you don't know if you need 5,000 or 20,000 to implement your project, then it will be very hard for you to find a good donor fit. You will need to find a proper fit that funds in the range that you want to work in. And without knowing exactly how much money you need for your project, it's very difficult to determine the range that you need. So that's why I would always say, if possible, do it as early as possible during the project planning phase. Because also writing the budget forces you to sit down, collect a lot of evidence, collect a lot of data, find out in detail how much things are, if they are available, if you need to do further research, etc. In reality, I know that the budget often gets developed when you apply for funding, and then sometimes you kind of have to squeeze your budget expectations into what the donor has to give and has to offer. So that then can become an issue, and you should always try to go for as much money as you need and not just as much money as the donor can give you in an ideal world. Budgets get developed for when you have the project plan or when you want to submit a proposal. But there's other uses for budgets as well, where you can use the budget for the benefit of your organization. So it's not only in the proposal and in the project plan, but also in other circumstances. For example, if you have a budget and you have developed a great budget, it gives you a lot of transparency with partners, with donors, with supporters, etc. Because when you've written down a budget, you can report on the budget, you can make sure and show that that you're spending the money in the way that you were supposed to, spending the money in the way that you planned to and that you promised to. I see that some of you put a couple of questions in the chat. Please use the Q&A box so I can get back to the questions in the end. That makes it way easier for me if I don't have to go sift through all the messages in the chat. If you have a budget, you can also make sure you get value for money. You have to go out, ask for quotations. You have to go out to understand prices. You have to compare, etc. So oftentimes you will get way better value for money if you have a budget and you know how to report on it. You will develop capacity to dealing with finances the more budgets you develop, so that's a plus as well. Competitiveness, because if you have to write a budget, present it to someone, justify it, you will make sure that it is competitive. You will be able to enter into competition maybe with other organizations, and you will ensure that the work you're doing is streamlined and is effective. And you also learn and understand how to follow guidelines, which is super helpful in proposal writing, because you do need to follow the guidelines that the donor gives you. You need to understand them, and that is a skill that is super, super helpful long-term when you want to keep writing proposals. So now we get to the part where we structure the budget. Sorry, I'm a bit distracted in the chat. I think my team is sending messages not to everyone, but just to the host. So maybe you have to recheck that the messages go out to everyone. So there's different ways and two main ways how to organize a project budget. Mostly the donors will tell you what kind of budget they want to see and the way they want to organize it, or they want to see it organized. You have the main way that budgets are organized and that you will find, which is by activity. And then there's another way, which is called by line item, which is a little bit more difficult. And you will see on the next slides how that looks like. It is super important that you coordinate with your donor, that you ask them and find out what kind of budget they want to see. If they want to see a budget organized by activity or by line item. Because obviously, if it's in the guidelines, you have to follow that system. And a budget by line item is way more complicated and more difficult to do and to develop. So if you can, you always want to do it by activity. Even if you have to do it by line item, you still have to start by doing it by activity, because otherwise it's super difficult and challenging. But donors have specific reasons for why they want to see it one way or the other. So it's very important that you ask and find out what kind of a budget they want to see. In my experience, the simple grant, small grant programs, usually then it's enough to just submit an activity-based budget, and the more complicated it gets when you include more personnel costs, or maybe when there's caps on how much personnel you can include, people move to a line item-based one. So here's an example for a budget by activity. By activity just means that basically with the budget, you follow along the activities that you have planned in your project, and you write down all the types of costs that will incur for each activity. Usually in your project description, or sometimes when you have a log frame, you have listed out all the activities that you want to do within your project, that you want to implement. And in this kind of budget, you just follow those activities. In this example project, which is a simple one, but just to show you how it can be done, you start with an activity 1, which is an annual conference that this organization wants to run. And then they sat down and really visualized this activity and planned out what kind of cost occurs for this activity. So obviously they need a trainer, need a person to give a speech, give a keynote, hold the workshop, whatever happens at that conference. They need a venue where they can hold that conference, where people can go to. They need transportation for participants because they want people to get there. Maybe this is a bit far away. Maybe they need a bus. Maybe they're flying people in, but for that cost, probably it's not flying in. It's probably a bus, just transportation to the venue. Then you need catering, because people need to eat, need to drink something if they spend a whole day at a conference, and apparently that is covered as well. And then you need materials and handouts per person. So that could be flyers, could be just papers, etc. This basing the budget on activities has the upside that you can just logically go through the activity and kind of go through the steps to not forget anything. Because it's easier than you might think to just forget a step. My thing is that when I started my career, on 2 proposals, I forgot to include transportation cost for materials because I didn't, it was a new country for me, and I didn't realize that we'd have to pay so much for a truck to get the material to the place where we needed it. So that taught me to really, when I write the budget, sit down with team members, with other people who are experts in this activity, to go through every single step to understand what we have to pay for, and what we have to cover, what kind of cost. We have the second example here, which is a volunteer training, which again needs a trainer, a venue, catering, and handouts. It's just one day. The trainer is cheaper, so it's a different kind of training. But this is the second activity. And this way, obviously, you can go through everything when you run a project. You have units. This is just one example what a budget can look like. If you have a simple project like this, I think this format makes a lot of sense. You have units. So in this case, it's per day or per person, but it can be per piece, per month, per hour, whatever. The number of units you need. So this annual conference is supposed to be 2 days long. The volunteer training is 1 day. And there's in the conference, there's supposed to be 40 participants, and in the volunteer training, 15. Then you have the unit rate, so how much is one unit, and then the total cost. So this is just a simple Excel file with formulas in it, so you can copy paste and continue like this. Again, very logical, and this is also why we say it's a description of your project in numbers, because even though you don't know the justification and the kind of framework, if you read this, you still kind of understand what this project wants to do, and you still get an overview of the steps they want to take. And here we have the other version, which is the budget by line item. Line item basically means you have different categories of cost, different categories of kinds of costs that you can calculate together. So here in this example, we have the categories personnel, services, and other costs. This means that then you combine the entire cost for personnel in this project and take the sum. And you combine the cost for all services and you end up with a sum. I think the reason that sometimes donors want to see it like that is they have specific percentages that, for example, they want to spend on personnel. I know many donors that say, okay, well, you can just spend 30% of the budget on personnel. So to be able to see that quickly, they want you to write this kind of budget. Or many donors that say, okay, just a specific percentage can be spent on materials. Or on other costs, sometimes the core cost falls into that. So just to see those percentages, donors like to see it this way. The categories can be different. Oftentimes, when a donor asks you to submit a budget by line item, they will also tell you the categories. So they will tell you in which categories you're supposed to split your budget up, because those are the specific numbers that they're interested in. So if you're not sure, always check back with the donor, always try to figure out and communicate with the donor if they want to see this one budget or the other. So these are the main two ways of developing the budget. As you can imagine, it is almost impossible to come up with a line item based budget out of the blue, because it's so easy to forget a step. In general, I think it is a challenge to not forget any step in the budget. So you really need to be careful in going through every step. And when you do that by activity, like we showed in the first slide, that is relatively logical at least, but by line item, it would be super challenging to not forget anything. So even if you have to submit something by line item, I would always recommend to first do an activity-based one and then move to this version, because then you can also compare the total, and it needs to be the same, otherwise you've missed something or you've left something out. So this is very easy to then convert from one version to the other. So I would always recommend to start with an activity-based one, even if you have to submit a line item-based one. Now we have the question, who should write the budget? Which is closely connected to the question, who should write the proposal, which we always get. It's not that easy, but it's not that difficult either, because usually we recommend this to be a team effort. Many people have input on the proposal, but also on the budget, obviously. So if you can collect input from team members, but also from partners, from the donor, collect information. Obviously, they will not sit down with you and develop the budget with you, but they will share information about what they want to see in a budget, which is also super important. So what you're supposed to focus on, etc. So all of these people do have input. There needs to be one person who is responsible, who takes over responsibility for developing the budget, but everybody else in your organization and in your team probably has some kind of input, some kind of information that could be useful for you. So here we are still, I think the heading of this slide is not correct, still talking about who is supposed to write the proposal, the budget, and have input on it. And we have this big question mark. And like I said, there's no one correct answer. One person obviously should be responsible for collecting, combining all this information, putting it together, and yeah, be responsible for moving the process along. But everybody else probably has some kind of input. Specifically, if you have an accountant in your organization, it's very, very helpful if they can have a say, especially if you have to apply or if you're applying for personnel, and this can get very, very complicated very quickly. If you're working in a country that has fairly complicated or challenging tax laws, it can be very tricky to include everything that you need to include. So then always ask an accountant to at least take a look or give you some input on how to develop the budget. The proposal writer obviously can be the one taking over the responsibility, the program manager, the fundraiser, maybe not senior management, but they definitely have input. So if you can collect all of that information, combine it into the budget, and yeah, account for everyone's point of view and for everyone's input that you have collected. Now we get to the different kinds of costs that you can also sometimes include in the budget. It can be a bit tricky because not every donor allows that. So I would always recommend to try to check with the specific donor you write a budget for if they allow that, if they allow a specific percentage for these kinds of costs, or if they do not. And this is a good conversation starter, I would say, when we always recommend that you try to network with donors, that you try to establish a connection with them before you send a proposal. So questions about these very specific areas of the budget can be a good conversation starter. But obviously, for that, you also need to know exactly what they mean and what they imply. So one big category is the overhead cost. That is the cost that occurs to run an organization that's not directly related to the project implementation. So oftentimes this is cost like rent for buildings that your offices are in, insurance, or also stuff that does benefit your project and where your organization wouldn't be able to work without it, but they are not directly employed within the project. So this could be the accountant or the CEO, or yeah, somebody else working in the organization, the janitor even, people that you have to pay, that you need in your organization, but that are not directly employed by your project. So this is the overhead cost, or sometimes called core cost. Oftentimes donors, let me see if there's a slide here. No. Oftentimes donors, sorry, now I jumped ahead. Yeah, sorry, my mouse is not working correctly. It just went into the wrong direction. Oftentimes donors will allow you to include a specific percentage. This can be 10%, can be 15. I've seen one time 20% with a donor that was very generous and had a good understanding of what is needed. Sometimes they will not tell you anything, and again, then to just include a percentage, I would check first, because some donors don't like it. Some donors don't want to pay overhead cost, which in my opinion is not very useful, because it's really difficult to ensure sustainability of an organization if the overhead is not covered. But unfortunately, that's the reality. But oftentimes you will find a specific percentage that you can put up for this when you go through the guidelines and you carefully check the full guidelines to see what exactly is included. Then we have co-payments or own contribution, or different things that this may be called. That is a payment that the donor requests from the NGO side. That can be from your organization side or directly from the project participants. Both sometimes exists. Also there, usually there's a percentage that the donor asks for. Sometimes it's 10%, but it can be very, very high. It can be up to 50%, which then obviously can be a struggle because particularly small organizations are not able to shoulder 50% of the project cost. That's why you're usually out there looking for grants. This own contribution, donors ask for that, I think, to ensure that that you're 100% on board, that project participants are on board, that they want to support this project, and that it comes from the community. Obviously, also, they don't want to spend everything. They don't want to be considered as like a cash cow. There's different things to it, but you have to find a way to cover for that cost. And this can be different things, like we mentioned when we looked at the income side. This can be through a proper income if you have a social enterprise. This can be other donations. This can be other grants. Wherever that money comes from, you have to make sure that you can cover that percentage that the donor asks for. If you want to cover it with another grant, for example, you apply for a bigger amount with a big organization, and then you have a small grant from another foundation to cover your co-payment. I would also check if that is okay for that small organization. Oftentimes it is, but some donors, again, they don't want to be the ones giving the co-payment. They want to be the ones giving the main payment. So again, this is something that you have to discuss with your donors if you can use their grant money for co-payments for other projects. Then we have something called contingency cost. That is a cost that you expect or fear might occur, but you're not 100% sure. So this could cover, for example, exchange rate changes, fluctuations, or price changes. That if in the time span between you writing the budget and the proposal and the donor giving you the money, the price of the items that you need to implement your projects have risen drastically. Contingency cost would be a position to cover that. This is something that donors really do not like if you include it. Usually they want you to not include that, and it looks better in a proposal. We don't really recommend to include contingency cost. But if you live in a country where the currency, for example, is highly volatile, where it keeps rising and falling to a very high degree, maybe there's a justification to include a position, but then with an explanation, not just putting contingency cost 5% or miscellaneous, etc., but have a good explanation in the narrative why you feel like you have to include this buffer. Also, if you work in a country where, for example, inflation is extremely high at the moment, and you expect prices to rise very, very much, you can also explain that and then maybe include some cost for that. But I wouldn't just put it in broadly. I would be as specific as possible so that donors understand why you had to include this position. So it's not a position that you put in there to cover in case you miscalculated, but that it's a position you put in there because you are an expert in your country and you expect things to change or to be you expect there to be a risk that things might change a bit. But again, this is a bit tricky because many donors don't like this category. And then we get to the budget narrative, which is a part where you again include text in underneath or at the bottom at your budget. And a budget narrative, as the word already says, is an explanation, a further explanation to your budget. This might be needed when the numbers don't speak for themselves. So when you feel like there's another layer of information needed so that people can understand your budget better, or that people can understand the um, the reason why specific numbers are in there. I have one example, I think, which makes it very, very clear why sometimes a narrative can be important, or some extra explainer. I applied for money for a project in Ecuador a couple of years ago. It was a reforestation project, and we applied for money to buy seeds and fertilizer, and then obviously stuff like transportation was connected to it. And the seeds, I think, I don't remember exactly the order of it, but I think the seeds we bought upstream, and the fertilizer we bought downstream. So the village was basically in the middle. The distance we had to cover was pretty much the same for both. But with the seeds, we were going upriver with the empty boat and downriver with the full boat. So we didn't have to spend much on petrol. But for the fertilizer, we were going downriver with the empty boat and upriver with the full boat. And we had to spend way more petrol for that way. And I knew that, so I included triple the cost for transportation for the same amount of kilometers for the fertilizer than for the seeds. And I was very lucky that in that case, the donor, because they really liked the project, they called me and they said, I think you made a mistake here. There's a wrong number for transportation. And then I was able to explain to them, no, actually not a mistake. There's a reason for this. But obviously, if you don't have that additional layer of information, you will never be able to understand why this cost is different. So that was a very clear case where a budget narrative would have helped. And this is true for other times where you feel like, okay, just looking at the numbers, this is not logical, this doesn't make sense. A donor would need some more information to be able to understand what I want to say here, and why I included this particular kind of cost, and yeah, this amount. I've already went over this. I think every time when you need to include more information, you should write a budget narrative, and it usually goes under the budget part. So you have your file, your Excel file, or whatever you're working with, your table with the budget, and then underneath you can write a little bit of text if you're free in the format to explain some of the numbers. But just do it if the additional information is necessary. If it's clear cut and logical and there's no additional information necessary to understand it, you don't have to include a budget narrative, as long as it's not asked for by the donor. If a donor asks for one, of course you have to write one, because that's the way it always goes. Whatever the donor asks for, we have to show in the proposal. And now we're coming to the end, and I have 10 quick tips left for you to write a great budget. First tip is always to not leave it for last. We see that many times that the budget is developed last minute, and then there's mistakes, there's numbers that are not correct because there's no time to properly research them. The format looks bad, or it just looks rushed. You can almost see that. So don't leave it for your very last task in the proposal writing process. Develop the budget while you develop the project, because then it reflects every single step of your project the way you want it to. Make sure you have all the correct numbers, so do research, go out, ask in shops, ask people for quotations for their services, so that you have the correct numbers and you don't just guess. Because guessing is never a good idea when you have to write a budget, because you will apply for that amount of money, and no donor likes it when you come back later and say, we were just guessing that price and actually they're charging us double now, so we need more money. That almost never works. Make sure you really research this stuff, that you save your data, that you write down properly what you have asked for, etc. Choose one format and stick with it. especially if more than one person are working on a budget or on a proposal in general. Sometimes we see that different tools were used, different formats, etc., and that always looks unprofessional. So just use one, stick with it, have one person be responsible for this whole process, and go on with it. Check the math, and not only once, and ideally also have it checked by someone else, because mistakes happen so quickly. And as much as I love Excel because you can use the formulas, etc., when you copy parts of the budget, it happens so quickly that you also copy a mistake, that you end up having a wrong formula, etc. Just be very, very careful with this, so that you just submit stuff that is 100% correct. Calculate realistically, so don't overcalculate, don't undercalculate. Research the correct numbers and then use them as a correct and realistic representation of what you want to do and what you want to implement. Make sure you include everything. Try to develop this in a team and with people who know exactly every single step of the way. Think about inflation and exchange rates. If you can, think about how to include part of this in the proposal, show the exchange rate that you're working with, and if you see the risk of the exchange rate changing drastically, you can write a narrative, let people know that you think this will change, and how you want to work with this. Explain extraordinary cost. So if there's anything that is not logically explained, that wouldn't make sense without some context, give the context. Don't leave people guessing. Make budget writing a group activity so that you get input from everyone who's supposed to be working on this project and might have some important input, and have someone proofread your budget in the context of your proposal. Because this is another quite common mistake that we see, is that the budget feels like it's just tacked onto the proposal and it's not one full document. And that never looks good. That doesn't give a good impression. So make sure that the budget is part of your proposal, that it's one holistic document, and that somebody proofreads it and makes sure that the budget properly reflects your proposal, that everything is included, and that it's a description of your project. If you want to learn more about budgets, with more details and tons of downloadables, we have just recorded and developed a full online course about budget writing for nonprofits. It's on our website, and it includes 5 modules where we go into a lot of detail in the kinds of costs you can include, the types of budgets that there are. I share tons of my experience and tips and tricks from the last 12 years, and we've just developed it this week, or finished it this week, so it's brand new, very recent, and I can really recommend for you to take this course. The usual price of this is 120, but because we're just starting, and because you all took part in this webinar today, with the coupon code budget 2025, you can get it for $60 only if you go buy it now. It's an exclusive offer for our webinar participants, and it's only valid for 2 weeks. So obviously you can get it, but if you know someone who would like to learn more about budgets for nonprofits, feel free to share the link as well. We're okay with that. We want as many people as possible to profit from this. Again, we've worked very, very hard on this course, and I would love it if some of you would take advantage of this offer to learn more about budgets. We have downloadables as well, templates, etc., that you can work with to develop your own budget in the next project proposal. We also have many other online courses on our website, philanthropia.org, that you can check out. Topics like how to raise funds in humanitarian emergencies, networking, all the steps of fundraising, how to fundraise when your NGO is brand new, many, many different topics that you can check out at philanthropia.org. And for that, you can also get 35% off in this case with the coupon code fundraise, if you want to take any any of the courses that are available or download any of our resources. Okay, so now we still have time for questions, and I see there's a couple of in the Q&A box as well. But first of all, I want to thank you all for taking part. I hope this was useful for you today, and that you were able to take away something from this webinar. If this is useful for you, it's always great if you leave us a review, for example, on LinkedIn, or just leave us a comment here. It's always nice to hear back. You can also give us some feedback by email to info@philanthropia.org. It's always really nice to hear some feedback, and because we want to reach more people, we're always collecting reviews of our materials, of our courses. So if you're willing to do that, please reach out to info@philanthropia.org. That would be very nice as well. Do you have a template that can be used by a new NPO? We do have templates that are included in the course, but I think with the one you've seen that I showed today, it's very, very easy to recreate that. It's just a simple Excel file that we work with that includes the categories and has the very, very simple calculations. Oftentimes, you will also get a template from the donor that you just have to fill out. So if you have any specific opportunity that you want to apply with, maybe ask them and reach out if they have a template for you to use. Then there's a remark by Fumi. Thank you for helping us to remind about the value of in-kind and volunteer contributions to the income. How do we extend the strategic budgeting to organizational budgeting? Well, I mean, if you write a budget for your entire organization and you have people that contribute towards your projects through their volunteer work or they give you in-kind contributions, you can always put the monetary value of those contributions on the income side. Yeah, kind of reflected there. Usually you would use the market value of either the materials and also the working time. So you can, if you have a person, a skilled worker that spends 2 or 3 days on your project, you can account the monetary value of how much you would have to pay on the market if you would hire that person or if you would have to pay for them. I hope that kind of gets to it. I hope I understood the question correctly. Where can we find donors for projects? Most times, new nonprofits don't attract donors because they're new and don't have experience. We have a couple of courses about this. We have webinars as well about donor research that are free, so you can go to our YouTube page and check out and maybe watch some of those. A very simple way is to check out organizations that do similar work to yours, so that maybe work in the same community as you do very similar work, and check who funds them. Because oftentimes, then if it's a foundation, if they have more funding, they might also be interested in funding you. So it's always worth asking them. If you're a new NGO, it makes a lot of sense to start small with small grants, something that you can manage and that an organization will be willing to give you. And then you can collect experience from there, and you can maybe collect a review from them and then go further. Then there's a question from Eric. In some budget templates, it's mentioned fixed cost versus variable costs. How do we identify them? To be honest, fixed in without more context, I'm not 100% sure what this means. Maybe this means the difference. I can imagine it means the difference between cost that will incur no matter how many participants take part, and variable costs might be cost that occur per person that attends. That will be my guess without any more context at the moment. Then Angelo says, yeah, when we're budgeting, we're told not to budget for miscellaneous. We're told to budget even for those unforeseen events, which tend to be very hard. Any suggestions? Yes, that is sometimes very hard. Things like currency changes, or the change of prices sometimes can be included, but again, in close cooperation with the donor. I think a renegotiation of the budget, if something drastically changes, is always possible as long as you have a good relationship. So it's super important to be open with your donor. If anything changes, or if you feel like you cannot reach specific milestones, or if there's any issues in your way, that you communicate that clearly, and that that you have a relationship of trust with your donor, so that you can maybe renegotiate in cases where this happens, although that's never ideal, obviously. Sometimes you can also cover some unexpected expenses through line items, if you plan ahead and if you do very good risk analysis. But in general, it's very hard. If something drastically changes, usually you have to renegotiate, unfortunately. We will share everything via email, the email that you signed up for this with us, so you should receive it. And then what's the best ratio for programming cost and admin cost? That's not easy to say. I think it depends a lot on the project. Many give 15%. I said I've seen 20 once, but usually the cutoff is 15, which is not realistic, because I would say usually in a project you spend at least 30% on admin, because these costs occur. We cannot discuss them away. You need an accountant, you need an office, you need to pay insurance, you need to pay rent. So the cost is there, but sometimes you can still include them as line items. So if you have one room in your office that is just for your project, maybe you can include that as a project cost instead of trying to cover it through the core cost or through the overhead. But I think what donors want to see is 15%. What is probably realistic is 30, in my experience and in my opinion. Okay, those were all the questions left in the Q&A box. Thank you again for participating in today's webinar. Again, I hope some of you can take advantage of the course, which has much more details, many more downloadables and materials that you can work with. And yeah, I hope to see you in one of our next webinars again. For now, I wish you a great rest of the day, and thanks again. Bye-bye.